Okay, good afternoon. All right, let's start the today's topic is very interesting, use of force. May we invite the today how many? 6 participants for group presentation. Please come up to the podium. Thank you.
Okay. Today, our group would like to discuss about whether military actions without the approval of the Security Council are sometimes effective in maintaining peace and security with this question. Can military actions not authorized by the Security Council be in some cases useful to maintain peace and security? Okay. So this is our outline, but before we go into specific detail, I would like to clarify several preconditions regarding this topic. First, we need to define what are military actions to maintain peace and security. In our group, we listed 3 criteria based on Article 1 of the United Nations Charter to determine the quality of military action to maintain peace and security, whether the act works as a suppression of conflict or massacre, promotes human rights security, and is requested by the residents. Next, in terms of the resolutions and decision-making process, the United Nations Security Council takes primary responsibility to fulfill the mission of the United Nations, which is to maintain international peace and security. As you know, the Security Council consists of 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members elected by the General Assembly for 2-year terms. Each member of the Security Council has 1 vote, and 9 votes, including the concurring votes of all 5 permanent members, are needed to pass resolutions. Even if there are 9 affirmative votes, without the full approval of the 5 countries, the decision would not be passed on. And this is called the rule of the great power unanimity. And the Security Council can also make recommendations to take enforcement measures to maintain or restore international peace and security if it defines as a threat and breach to the peace or act of aggression. And the important point here is that under the Charter, all members of the United Nations legally agree to accept and carry out decisions made at the Security Council. And other organs of the United Nations may make recommendations to governments, but the Security Council is the only organ that has complete power to make decisions which all member states have the obligation to accept and carry out. However, even if this decision is made and the Security Council is legally binding, there are states that do not follow the resolutions in reality. So we would bring our thesis that authorized military actions are mostly based on international cooperation to pursue the maintenance of peace and security of the states or actors involved. On the other hand, due to the dysfunction of the Security Council, countries pursue its individual and national interests and profits rather than international cooperation in keeping peace and security, which would be a cause of unauthorized military actions. So from now on, we are going to cover several conflicts in which military actions authorized and not authorized by the Security Council were taken and how they turned out. Okay. My name is Yuri, and
my name is Mizuki, and my name is Mizuho.
My name is Takamasa.
My name is Chihiro.
I'm Shion.
Okay, so I'll explain the case of military action authorized by Security Council. And for that, I picked case of Gulf War. It is Kuwait. And I explain the background of Gulf War a little bit. In 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait to get oil field. At that time, Iraq had a month of challenge caused by Iraq and Iran war. Then the invasion was criticized by international society strongly. In order to get an overview, I draw up the timeline events. First, August 2, 1990, Iraq started to invade Kuwait. Same day, UN Security Council resolved the Iraq action as disruption of international peace and security. And They requested Iraq and Kuwait government to resolve the conflict. 4 days later, August 6, UN Security Council decided to impose economic sanctions to Iraq. And August 9, US reported to Security Council that the US would send troops as individual and collective security defense to Kuwait as military alliance. From this point, it could be said that UN did not take military action by themselves. After months, November 29, UN Security Council has voted Resolution 678, which judged that Iraq did not implement formal resolution, and they authorized all countries of UN to use all necessary means to recovery, peace, and security in the areas. And the words of all necessary meanings was interpreted to be permitted to take military action. The coalition force was organized as form of collective security. And 15 January 1991, coalition force started to military action, and at 2 March, United Nations Security Council decided to end military action by coalition force. 1 week later, Kuwait government showed gratitude to international society on Washington Post. And 3 April, UN Security Council seeked Iraq to armistice. From this flow, it can understand that military action to give war was organized by UN Security Council, and it was UN collective security. However, some researchers pointed out that purpose of major power country is not only international cooperation, but which is to protect Kuwait, but also pursue their own interest. But here, a question is that why they do not take military action by themselves, but cooperate with each other. In order to pursue their own interest, it is better to intervention by themselves, not forming collective security as well as Syria and Crimea, which we explain later. One answer of this question is that national security of permanent country and public interest which stop Iraq intervention jumped together. For example, U.S. interest was to rebuild national security by world security demand. And in addition, they tried to get oil and hegemony in international security after Cold War by Gulf War. However, they judged that taking military action by themselves was high risk. Then they agreed to collective security. And other Soviets did not want to be assumed the hegemony by the US, but at the same time, Soviets became impoverished by Cold War. Therefore, they couldn't against the US by oneself. Not only US and Soviet, but also interest of UK and France and China shared with authorized military action. Then, what realization of military action authorized by Security Council is not only international cooperation, but also major power countries' interest and profit. However, we conclude it as useful to maintain peace and security by using our definition of peace and security. First, it suppressed conflict, and second, it stopped intervention of Iraq against one nation state, which is Kuwait, and promoted human rights. Third, it is requested and appreciated by Kuwait government. Therefore, the case of Gulf War, which is Kuwait, is a case that system of US could limit major power to pursue their own national security and profit, and fulfill international public interest and international cooperation.
So now I'll talk about the second case of Syria in which unauthorized military action was taken. As you can see, the situation in Syria is very complicated since many national interests of different countries are intertwined. So we have decided to look at mainly on state actors such as Syria, Russia, US, UK, and etc. So I would like to look at the first unauthorized military action that took place in 2017 and what provoked it. So on April 4th, 2017, the Syrian government used chemical weapons against its civilians in the northwestern Syria, Khan Sheikhoun, killing more than 83 people and injuring around 300. The next day, the UN Security Council called an emergency meeting. And on April 6th, there was an unauthorized military action, which I will talk about more in the next slide. On April 12th, the UN Security Council rejected a draft for OPCW's fact-finding mission, which was presented by the UK. This draft had 10 votes in favor, with a veto from Russia and Bolivia voting against it, and 3 abstentions from China, Kazakhstan, and Ethiopia. So, as I have mentioned before, on April 6th, the US fired 59 Tomahawk cruise missiles to the Shayrat air base in Syria to immobilize the airstrikes by the Syrian government. This air base was used to store the chemical weapons, and the aircraft responsible for the April 4th chemical attack is said to have taken off from this airbase. And Russia, Iran, and Syria have condemned the unauthorized military action, with President Putin labeling them as an aggression against the sovereign state in violation of the norms of the international law. President Assad has also said that the strikes were unjust and unabashed assault against Syria. However, countries supporting or understanding the strikes, such as the UK, has stated that the strikes were appropriate response to the barbaric chemical weapons attack launched by the Syrian regime and is intended to deter further attacks. And Prime Minister Abe has also stated that the Japanese government supports the US government's resolve that it will never tolerate the use and spread of chemical weapons. So now I will also talk about the more recent use of chemical weapons in Syria, which took place on April 7th, 2018 in Douma, where 70 people have died and around 500 people were injured, showing symptoms of chemical attack. And Syria, Russia, and Iran have denied accusations and have blamed the rebels and the opposition of fabricating the story. And US officials are, however, confident that the chemical used in the attack was chlorine gas and another unnamed chemical, after blood and urine samples were tested from the victims. And on April 10th, the UN Security Council failed to adopt a US proposed resolution for investigating the chemical attack in Douma, since Russia vetoed. And Bolivia also voted against, while 12 members voted in favor and China abstained. On April 14th, there was an unauthorized military action, which Takamasa will talk about more in the next slide. And on April 16th, Russia and Syria were accused of delaying the Douma investigation and trying to cover up the evidence of the chemical attack.
As Mizuho explained, on 14th April, after the UN Security Council failed to adopt resolutions penned by United States and Russia, US, France, and the UK launched strikes against the Syrian regime, targeting chemical research centers and storage centers in Greater Damascus and Homs. US fired 66 Tomahawk missiles and 90 JASM missiles to chemical weapon-related sites. UK and France fired 20 missiles. There have been many reactions to the unauthorized military actions, but I want to focus on some main state actors in the Syrian conflict. Russia and Iran, which support Assad regime, have condemned the strikes. Russia described the strikes as a flagrant violation of international law. Iranian Foreign Ministry emphasized the strikes as violation of international laws, as well as ignoring the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia, which support anti-Assad group, Army of Islam and Israel expressed full support for the strikes. Interesting to point out is Turkey's position on the strikes, because Turkey is supposed to have the close relationship with Russia. Turkish Prime Minister Binali Yildirim welcomed the strikes, but also expressed a disappointment because the strikes were not enough for permanent peace. Then, in this slide, I will evaluate the recent strikes in 2018. To some extent, the strikes against the Assad regime can be explained as illegal but legitimate. It is illegal since the use of military force was not approved by the UN Security Council and violated the international law. However, I suppose it can be viewed as legitimate for 4 reasons. Firstly, UN Security Council did not efficiently work due to the interest of each state. Secondly, since the strikes were targeted and limited, it didn't intend the regime change. Thirdly, using chemical weapons is a violation of international law. The aim of strikes was to prevent using chemical weapons, so the strikes were relatively passive. Finally, the strikes were also aimed to protect human rights. In Syria, hundreds of thousands of innocent people have been killed or wounded by Assad regime. Considering these all elements, the strikes were interpreted as legitimate. Furthermore, though this is my personal opinion, the strikes can be described not only as legitimate but also legal. It's because when conventions are repeated, I mean in this case the strikes, conventions have a possibility to become international law. I guess it may be possible to say the strikes are not illegal in the future. So let's see whether both unauthorized strikes maintain peace and security or not. Anti-Assad residents welcomed the strike to some extent, but Assad regime didn't require, so it is difficult to conclude whether both strikes were requested by Syrian residents. Regarding our definition 1 and 2, 2017 strikes was not successful, I think. It didn't work as suppression of conflict or massacre and promote human rights security because the strikes couldn't prevent and deter the spread and use of chemical weapons. 2018 strikes can be analyzed more effective than 2017's. However, since the strikes were limited and targeted, Syrian conflict is not over. It is unlikely peace and security in Syria will improve significantly by the strikes. Also, it has possibility to escalate the tension in the region. Therefore, it is still difficult to maintain peace and security. From next slide, Chihiro will explain the Crimean issue.
So now we would like to move on to our next case, which is the annexation of Crimea by Russian government. So before getting into the details, I would like to give you guys some background of how this annexation had happened. So this is a map of Ukraine, Crimea, and its neighborhood. And as you can see, Crimea is located in the southern part of Ukraine, and more than 60% of the residents belong to Russian ethnicity because of the historical reason. This picture shows who voted for either pro-Ukrainian candidate or pro-Russian candidate during the Ukrainian president election in 2014. As you can see in this picture, Crimea is colored with deep red, which shows that most of the residents voted for a pro-Russian candidate. And as a result, pro-Russian candidate was elected for the next president. And because of this, those residents who are pro-Ukrainian and those who try to maintain the close relationship with EU started to protest against him. And this movement became quite intense that Russian military was sent to suppress it. And this movement is called the Ukrainian Revolution 2014, which actually triggered the annexation of Crimea. And at the same time, the Russian military took over most of the key infrastructure in Crimea, including the regional airports. And the Russian government also replaced the prime minister of Crimea from the one who originally belonged to Ukrainian ethnicity to the one who belonged to Russian ethnicity, in order to have more influence over this region. So in March, Crimean residents have done the referendum to be independent from Ukraine and to accept the annexation of Russia. It is officially announced that more than 90% of the residents agree to be the part of Russia, but the validity and the legality of this vote itself is doubted among international society because it is said that Russian army has done military intervention to this region and they actually suppressed pro-Ukraine residents from going to the vote. This military intervention by Russia were not approved by UN Security Council at all, so Russia was criticized among the international society. In order to insist that the result of this referendum is illegal, Ukraine brought up the resolution to UN Security Council in March 2014. However, because Russia is the permanent member and they used veto, this resolution was rejected. So instead, similar resolution was adopted by UN General Council afterward, but because this was any resolution which is passed in UN General Assembly is not legally binding, so UN couldn't stop the military intervention of Russia, and it is still continuing today.
And now I explain the other member states' responses and claims. So first is Russia. On March 18, 2014, Russian President Putin made a declaration of annexation of Crimea. In his speech, he quoted, "In people's hearts and minds, Crimea has always been an inseparable part of Russia." The main reason why Russia annexed Crimea is to protect the ethnic Russian residents in Crimea. As Chihiro mentioned, there was a severe conflict between pro-Ukraine and pro-Russian, and Russian ethnic, who is majority in Crimea, requested protection to Russian army. Also, President Putin insisted in his speech that they share the same ethnic and cultural identity of Crimean residents, which used to be a part of the Soviet Union. And especially a port, Sevastopol, was a long symbolic place for Russian as the military base. He also quoted that everything in Crimea speaks of our shared history and pride. However, the real reason behind the annexation of Crimea is said to be that the Russians wanted to control the non-freezing port Sevastopol, which is the main trade route of natural gas and military base. So now I explain the Ukraine's claim. Even today, President Poroshenko officially claims that strongly opposed the annexation of Crimea and officially proposes that annexation of Crimea is illegal and Crimea remains as an integral part of Ukraine. He also urges Russia to fulfill its international commitments and obligations, such as Minsk agreements, and stop the aggression and to reverse the invasion. So let's look at other countries' responses. Except for countries who supported Russia, like China, North Korea, Venezuela, most of the countries led by the United States opposed to the Russian action and approved the resolution that Chihiro mentioned before. And here are the 4 pillars of the Western response. First is the very early decision not to defend the Ukraine military. This sounds strange since they are in favor, or they support Ukraine, but the reason behind this is because Ukraine is not part of NATO, and the Western countries wanted to first not worsen the situation in Crimea, and also cannot officially support Ukraine by their military force. And the second is the coercive diplomacy with the broad range of sanctions against Russia. Many sanctions was put on against Russia, such as travel bans of individuals, economic sanctions, like imports banned from Crimean goods, export ban of technology and energy, prohibition of investment, and also Canada, United States, and European Union prevented Russian and Crimean officials and politicians to travel to their countries. And the third one is diplomatic efforts to convince Russia to change course. And fourth is the support for Ukraine in order to increase its resilience when under Russian attack. And these 4 pillars were all agreed by all the EU members and countries, Western countries that includes Japan. So let's look at the definition that we have stated before, whether the Crimea annexation maintained peace and security of Crimea. So first, it did not work as suppression of conflict or massacre. Although Russia claims that they invaded Crimea to protect ethnic Russians from conflict between pro-Ukraine and pro-Russian, it rather caused more victims and worsened the situation in Ukraine, and of course, worsened the international relations among other member states in United Nations. So according to BBC, since 2014, more than 9,000 people have been killed in eastern Ukraine, including 2,000 civilians, and 22,000 people have been wounded, and 1.1 million others are extremely displaced. The second point, it did not promote human rights of Crimea. And the journalist says that since 2014, the Freedom of Speech Association and media have shrunk after the Russian invasion, and there has been constant torture, extrajudicial killings, discrimination, and attacks toward Crimean Tatar and pro-Ukraine activists and journalists. And the last point, whether it was requested by residents or not, in fact, it was requested by residents of Crimea. According to a referendum, more than 96% of residents favor in uniting with Russia. However, United States and other media say that the election may not be valid since it was done under the Russian military's supervision. In conclusion, the annexation of Crimea by Russia, which was unauthorized military action, was driven by Russia's national interest and ignored international peace and security. And now you explain the conclusion.
Okay, we'll make a brief conclusion, and our group came to a thought that military actions that were carried out with the authorization of the Security Council were successful in maintaining peace and security in the case of Kuwait. However, in a situation in which the structure of the Security Council is not effectively functioning, accepting the fact that unauthorized military actions is taken in cases like Syria and Crimea, there are occasions in which the reason for the states to dispatch military action is to fulfill national interests and profit, rather than to maintain peace and security in the international society. And this is rather intensifying the conflict in some cases. And in other words, the Security Council has the power to pass resolutions, but not always the power to enforce them. And due to this, it is leading to catastrophic situations. The definition of peace and security itself is very difficult to define in the first place, but this system of the Security Council is to be questioned since there are cases in which the supposedly legally binding Security Council resolutions are ignored, and the meaning of its existence is not valued. Therefore, in order to maintain peace and security, the current structure could be open for reconsideration. Okay, that's all. Thank you for listening.
I think that was a very good presentation, but I have some questions, and I'll come to that when they are ready. Okay, let's see the use of force. We have looked at during the last session that you are in the current international law, the system of United Nations, one country or collectively or individually, you can use force in various conditions. We have seen the, let's take the first slide. We have learned the last time that the United Nations system is a collective security, that everybody try to build the peace together. some country is invaded, this is invasion to you. So you are expected to fight back together. In reality, this is not always happening, and you can use your own right of self-defense. I think we have learned that Article 51 of the United Nations allows, for example, any country, the Japan, to exercise both self-defense, individual self-defense, and collective self-defense. Can anybody remember what's the difference between individual self-defense and collective self-defense? For example, when, let's see, take one example that the Kuwait is invaded by Iraq in 1990. Now, what Iraq can do, or he can exercise individual, collective, both self-defense. What is Kuwait can do using the individual self-defense? What is self-defense of Kuwait? Individual self-defense. What is this Kuwait can do? If you are Kuwait, you can use Article 51, individual self-defense. What the group who have force? What Kuwait? Who took up the question of Kuwait? Yes. When we say Kuwait exercise individual self-defense, what action exactly Kuwait is doing or was doing? Protecting themselves by military action. Ah, yes. So Saddam sent the military. So Kuwait is also alone. Kuwait, Iraq. What is then the collective self-defense that Kuwait used? What Kuwait did?
Since Kuwait have military alliance relationship with US, so they request US Army to cooperate with Kuwait and US.
Yes, Kuwait did not have any agreement with the United States. No, there was no alliance. But Kuwait, being the invaded, asked the United States to help me. United States helped them. This is collective self-defense. You cannot defend yourself, so you ask strong guys to help you. Collective self-defense. But you also said in your presentation that Kuwait was not a case of self-defense, but collective security. What is the difference?
The military action in Singapore was not only formed by UN military and other countries joined there.
Yes, I think that's the. Kuwait used the second Article 51, self-defense, at the beginning. You cannot call the police, call the United Nations. Can you help me? Iraq is invading us. Nobody come to rescue you. So you fight against the aggressor by yourself. But you are easily defeated. Simultaneously, Kuwait was asking the United States to help me. And the US could help and go alone to Kuwait to help Iraqi. Then this is a case of Article 1, collective self-defense. But the United States with the Kuwait, they went to United Nations, number one, Chapter 7. Let's see the next slide. They asked, they tried to use this Article 42 that people, the countries, United Nations can act together and punish, in this case, Iraq. So United States mobilized, this was Bush father president, he mobilized the Western world, Arab world, to fight against Saddam Hussein using the provisions of United Nations Chapter 7 enforcement action, so that you use force legally. That's, I think they spoke well on this issue. So why don't we go a little bit further, Akiyama-san. Slide number 3. Yeah, let's keep this. I want to speak before this, going to the case of Kuwait. In the 1950s, after the Second World War, there are lots of invasions. Lots of invasions. I picked up only 2. One is the Soviet invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. Czech started to have a change of government. Prime Minister or the new government tried to introduce the more liberal policy of free press and market economy. Soviet didn't like it, so they changed the government, going to Czechoslovakia in 1968. This was the time of Brezhnev. And he was called, this was called the Brezhnev Doctrine. If something happens in my camp, Soviet camp, this is not intervention. This is to keep the camp calm and peaceful. This was a 1968 invasion. United States started this Vietnam War, and this was also the military action by the United States. They argued, we are asked by the South Vietnamese government to help them fight against North Vietnam. There was a civil war using this Article 51 collective self-defense. Many of the war after the Second World War has been intrastate within the same country. What's the opposite of intrastate? It's interstate between the Kuwait and Iraq. That's interstate war. Many of the conflicts, military conflict, has been intrastate. It's not one sovereign country invading other, very classic war. It's a fight between the north and south, west and east, one tribe against another tribe. So this, in this case, many of the times we have seen Article 51, self-defense, collective self-defense has been used. And this is very closely connected to the presentation that the group made now. I want to come to that, but I take your question.
So my question is regarding Article 51 and self-defense. How much use of force is like described as self-defense? So basically, if we take Kuwait and Iraq war, say that Iraq invaded Kuwait, but Kuwait for some reason managed to defend itself, and it was pushing back the Iraqi forces, and suddenly, after they push them back enough, they are on Iraqi ground. They cross their borders and they push them back to Iraqi ground. Can Article 51 still be legitimate after they push them back from the borders and they're on the enemy ground right now, or is it considered an invasion and Article 1 does not?
I think that is a question of what is a self-defense. It's the, this is also argued in a domestic situation. If somebody attacks me, punched me, and can I punch him back? Yes, this is self-defense. Can I punch until he dies? This is called the, you are abusing this right of self-defense to the point that killing, you didn't have to, maybe you are not that damned or harmed. Maybe you can argue that he had a weapon, he may have killed you. So how much is this self-defense can you make? That is the typical argument when Mr. Bush was attacked, criticized later. Why didn't he go to Baghdad and kill Saddam? Then that was the end of it. And since Papa didn't kill Saddam, the son went and killed. This is typically the argument. But I think it was the resolution which allowed the all the states, whoever cooperating with Kuwait to fight against Iraq, is to return to the status ante. That means two countries separated by a border, and if the Iraqi government retreats to their own camp and declare that they have no further intention to attack, this is the end of self-defense. What are you going to do with the Kuwait later, Iraq later, is another question. So I think that is more or less analogy of domestic criminal case. So case one, let's see again. I want to say that many of the war which we see today, many in Africa, it is not interstate war. Many are interstate, South Sudan, Sudan. And the issue is complicated because the neighbors support one party, and the other neighbors support other party, using both Article 51. The government asked me to help, so we went. But which government? Go to the case study number 2. Case study number 2 is Kuwait. You have heard a very good. I thought the presentation was very good. I have nothing to add to that. Most important in the history of the United Nations is Resolution 678. Easy to remember. Resolution 678. This is a textbook of resolution of the Security Council authorizing us, every country, to cooperate with the government of Kuwait. And this is the most important word, to use all necessary measures. To use all necessary measures. That means you can do whatever you want. To implement the resolution 660, this is the earlier resolution. 660 is asking Iraq to go home. So you can do whatever you want to do to implement resolution 660. This is probably the most typical resolution in the post during the history of the United Nations. using Chapter 7 idea of collective security. The difference between what Charter says and what happened in Iraq, Kuwait in 1990 is that the forces which went to get the Kuwaiti Iraqi out to have a free Kuwait was American forces led by Colin Powell and the alliance. It was not the UN force as envisaged as Charter, but it is the closest to the Charter provisions. So this is the most typical Chapter 7 case, intrastate military conflict. Okay, let's go to the next one. I have included in the use of force case study 9/11. In 2001, 9/11, the terrorists, Al-Qaeda, attacked Twin Towers and people died. I was there on the day of 11th of September. On that day, this, again, important resolution of Security Council 1336, France was the president of the Security Council. They speak about inherent right of individual collective self-defense. This is not the case of Kuwait and Iraq. This is the case that United States was attacked by a foreign force and then many of their citizens killed, property damaged. So United States is using Article 51, individual self-defense. I will kill the person who did this to us. So this is United States has the inherent right of individual self-defense. There are many countries, including Japan, whose nationals were killed. There was even one ICU graduate who died. And so the Japan lost its national. And if we are asked by the United States to fight with them, if the Japanese constitution or politics allows, we could go to fight with the United States and fight the war of Afghanistan. NATO declared we are going to exercise collective self-defense and fight with the United States. This is the resolution 1336. Second paragraph, line, Security Council decided that this is a threat to international peace and security. So authorizing calls on all states to work together. This wording is a little bit different from the Iraqi war. This is calls on all states to work together. The other one is authorizes you to use whatever means you have at your disposal. But this is the Security Council authorizing the action of collective self-defense. So this is basically number 2 case, but Security Council giving the authority. This is 9/11. Let's go to the fourth case. The presentation today spoke what word they were using. Protection, human rights situation, was that? protection of human rights situation. You spoke about the Syria on this. Let's there was a lots of questions before Syria. Important discussion was the Rwanda and Kosovo in 1990s. In former Yugoslavia, Serbian government killed ethnic Muslims. And the Kosovo, many people have been killed. Politically speaking, Serbia, the government was supported by Russia. Muslims supported by Islam countries and also by the Germany and other European countries. United States helped the Europeans. In 1999, NATO bombed Serbia. The argument was if we keep this situation going, there will be more humanitarian catastrophe. And this was called humanitarian intervention. This is a new sort of argument to have justifies the use of force. This argument is last week used by British to defend their action in bombing Syria. They argued this is if we do not bomb now Syria, more Syrians will be killed by chemical weapons. So this is humanitarian intervention. Let's go to the last one. So this is the Syrian issue that you heard the presentation now. There has been bombing last year, April 2017 and 18. I was wondering who made the presentation on Syria. Okay. On Syria, you said there were requests by residents who asked the this was a Crimea. Who presented the Syria? Yes, the Syrian case, you had one of the criteria called request by residents. What do you mean by request by residents?
So, in this case, if Assad requests military action from other states, that will be authorized. It is sovereignty.
That this is the Article 51, collective self-defense. Mr. Assad is president of Syria. Can he ask Russia to help them to fight against the anti-Syrian government? Can he do that? Yes, he can. That's Article 51. And that's why Russians are there and fighting, helping the Assad regime to fight against the terrorists, fight against anti-government. But when you say request by residents, who are residents? That I don't understand. Who are they?
In that relation, residents is an anti-Assad government.
Anti-Assad. So that means there are in the intrastate situation, there is a fight between Assad government and the anti-Assad government. Residents means in your definition, it is people living under the or fighting against the Assad government. They are residents. And what about people who live in Damascus and who support the Assad government? Are they residents? They are also residents.
I think it's difficult to conclude whether it is requested or not.
Then I understand what you want to say. UN system in today's international regime, it is the components of international society is a sovereign state. The sovereign state means the government is normally elected, or if it is absolute ruler, he rules the country. But this is a legitimate government. So if you go to United Nations today, there is a seat of Syria. And then there is an ambassador called the Bashar who sits there. He represents who? He is appointed by President Assad. There is nobody who can say Syria is against this or in favor of this, except Syrian ambassador appointed by Syrian government. So according to today's international law, Syrian government can ask the help of Russia, collective self-defense. We are attacked by terrorists. We are attacked by. So what can we do with this poor residents who are suppressed by their own government? I mean, normally government is to protect your people. You're not supposed to use chemical weapon against your own people. So what can you do if a situation is that your own government is not protecting you? You cannot ask collective self-defense because you are not a country. You are not a legitimate government. What can you do? What can you do? I think you argued the Syria's case, bombing of United States, UK, and France. Can you argue that this is to protect the lives of these people who are the target of chemical weapon, who are target of killing by the government? This is the idea of humanitarian intervention. Let's go back to case 4. This is the argument of 1990s of humanitarian intervention. There was somebody who, was that one of you who divided illegal but legitimate? Is that you? Yeah, illegal but legitimate. Can you argue that bombing of Kosovo was illegal but legitimate? After this Kosovo bombing, Kofi Annan, he asked the international commission to find out was that really legal action or not? What are their views on the Kosovo bombing? And they said the Independent International Commission concluded that NATO bombing was illegal. There is no basis, authorization by the Security Council, but it was legitimate. Because if they didn't do this bombing to the Serbians, more lives were killed. So I thought you picked up that language, but this is 1990. Again, very classic argument of can we use force if nobody else does it? The situation becomes worse. Illegal but legitimate. I don't know. It's legitimate. But that's. I think it's a kind of a little bit of the. This is the dilemma of today, this international system. I have included case study 5. Now, I want to make some questions on the who have spoken? Crimea? Crimea. Yes, Crimea is interesting. I was very much interested in your argument that this was requested by residents. Who are residents when you say this was supported by residents? Living in Crimea?
Yeah, in the presentation, I'm a Crimean resident.
Mm.
But since some of the countries don't recognize Crimea as official state, I was not sure whether I can really call them the residents of Crimea.
ちょっとマイクはあった方がいいかわかんないね。This is very interesting discussion. I want to let's look at the some of the principles of international law. Today's United Nations system is territorial integrity. What's territorial integrity? What is territorial integrity? We have to respect, many people say, we have to respect territorial integrity. What it means? In your view, what is?
More like respecting the legitimate government in the region or that territory. So like not having.
You have to respect the territorial integrity in plain words means you cannot change border. You have to respect the existing border. You cannot change it. If your argument is we can respect the views of residents, and if the residents want to become part of Russia instead of the Ukraine, which is their nationality or the country, then many things might happen. You know, now in Europe, there is a big question on Catalonia. Barcelona is a capital of Catalonia. They want to be independent. They have done the referendum. There is no military of Russia, military of France, nobody. And they want to become independent. Spanish government said, no. Territorial integrity, you cannot become independent. United Nations also says self-determination of people. with that, many African countries become independent. They were part of controlled by France or Britain, territorial integrity. But self-determination of people. We are not French. We are occupied by the French. We have to be independent. So they became independent countries in the 1960s. Now, do you think that if people living in a region decide that we want to be independent or we want to be part of Russia, can they do that? If that is the will of residents. We know that in the case of Crimea, maybe many people argue that there were influence of Russia. It is, can we allow Catalonia to become independent? In the case of Crimea, maybe there is a Russia. They want to get that the territory in them to themselves. They are Russian speakers, ethnically Russian. But in the case of Catalonia, it's very peaceful. But can they become independent, in your views? Yes.
So it's against the idea of democracy.
Can, for example, if tomorrow people of Hokkaido, can they decide that we want to be part of Russia, not Japan? Okinawa, states. They can make opinion poll, referendum. You can you vote for independence or annexation to other country, and this voting is legal and should be permitted? That's probably no country allows that except you have a sort of a system to do that. Puerto Rico, outside of the United States, whether they can be part of the United States, you have to be agreed by both parties, Puerto Ricans and Americans. Some people want to be independent, but they have done some referendum, organized, agreed, and people want to continue to be part of the United States rather than becoming independent. The question, for example, Catalonia, this is the question of territorial integrity. If people start raising hand, I want to be part of France, part of the countries have many territorial problems in themselves. Belgium, Switzerland, Italy, France, today's world is based on self-determination of people. So the Egypt being part of Britain is not natural. It's not historically, it's not the historical consequence except the war and the power. So they became independent. But can they, within their border, can they divide them up by themselves? Today's international law supposes that this territorial integrity should be respected. There was also a referendum in Scotland. Scotland was once independent country. Catalonia never, but Scotland. And they want to become independent again. There was a referendum, and this was defeated. So they remain British. The decision to have a referendum can have a big consequence. So it is, if it is organized in a democratic manner, yes, you can. Except not anybody can start deciding where we should belong to. So Crimean referendum is not legal. It's not legitimate. Whatever referendum is made, it's not agreed by Ukraine. So this issue of will of residents, will of people, sounds very good, democratic, but in reality, it may not. Yes, you have a question.
My question was about Scotland. My question was about Scotland when you were speaking.
Yes. So there are independent countries joined together, separated, wars, annexation. This has been going on for centuries. After the Second World War, invasion prohibited, and this is in a way frees the territory of 1945 and live with it. This is the current international system, except there is a democratic, legitimate way of separating, or there has been lots of separation. Czech and Slovakia, well, same country. They decided to divorce. So you have Czech and Slovakia. Yugoslavia, now how many? 7 countries? So there has been separation. So Crimea's case is possible. The Crimea become independent, but not to belong to other country. So in that definition, I think you have to think a little bit more on this request by residents. Otherwise, you may go to very place that you don't want to go if you go after this request by residents. Okay, we have little more time for discussion. I want to conclude that in today's international system, use of force, fortunately, use of force has been controlled. You cannot use force whenever you want. This is illegal. And that's why United States, when they bomb Syria, they have to argue at the United Nations that why they bombed. And they have to convince the people that it was better than not using force. Russia's resolution saying that it was illegal was defeated. They got only 3 supporters, Russia themselves and China and Bolivia. So you cannot get authorization to bomb, but neither you cannot, nobody, well, at least at this juncture, Security Council as a whole cannot say it was illegal. So we are living in this illegality. To be legal is very difficult, as when the countries, 5 permanent members are involved. In this case, many cases, it's either the Russia, China and the United States. U.S. has invaded Grenada, many places, and they could not convince the United Nations. But this has been done. Russia has invaded Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan invaded at the request of legitimate government. So there has been lots of invasion, but we have to know that at least this use of force is regarded as illegal, and those who use have to explain. There is no punishment. You cannot punish Russia unless you are ready to go to a war, and nobody wants to. So we are looking at the United Nations system and all the system of self-defense, but the humanitarian catastrophes have been happening, and the idea of humanitarian intervention has born from this situation in the 1990s. It is not yet a legal concept. So all people could say it's illegal, but legitimate. Let's accept that reality. Okay, so you have 5 minutes to discuss among yourselves, and let's have a discussion of 20 minutes or so. Okay. Thank you. All right. Let's start the discussion. Give one microphone to the group. Okay, who want to start? Okay, yes, on the back. Give me your name.
Kurihara.
Kurihara-san. Okay.
This is not a question to the group over there,
okay,
but it's a direct question to Professor. And on the board and in this class, you mentioned territorial integrity several times. And this concept, a secular concept, which you've just written in English, I find it very hard to grasp. And in the case of Japan, this is a question because I thought you could answer this question. Because from your career as a professional, how would you define this or translate this into Japanese? The first question. And if you have a definite translation, why would you translate it in such a manner?
領土の一体性ですね。民族自決。領土の一体性。日本語では多分そう普通はそう言われますね。There are several rules that has been laid down after the war. One is you cannot win territory by war. For example, Japan gave up the land territory acquired during the several wars back to where it belonged. Taiwan was given to Japan and by China because Japan won the war against China, and Taiwan was returned to Republic of China. United States, after the Second World War, occupied, didn't take it as a territory, but administered islands of Ogasawara and also the Okinawa. And they have decided to return these territory to Japan. First Ogasawara, later Okinawa. Soviet Union at the close to the end of the war, they invaded the many places, North Korea and the Japanese territory in the north called Northern Islands, and they did not. Japan returned the former Soviet territory to Soviet Union, but this agreement did not cover the territory of Japan before the war with China, war with Russia. So this is the reason why we are claiming those islands which have been illegally occupied by China. Soviet Union, now Russia. Island Takeshima was taken by the South Korea at the very end of American occupation of Japan, which ended in 1951. So this was Japanese territory. We claim South Korea to withdraw from Takeshima. So this is sort of rule that has prevailed, and the territory which were in a way artificially militarily changed during the so-called time of imperial wars should be returned to the situation ante. This is the territorial meaning of territorial integrity. We should respect the existing territorial integrity, territorial border. That doesn't mean that you can tell others this was ours and you have to return it. This is a separate issue of this is called territorial dispute. There are quite a few, and territorial disputes are normally settled in the peace treaty. So the Europe, for example, all the border with Russia had been confirmed. Last one, I think it was Estonia. Russia does not have the territorial settlement with Japan. We don't have we haven't settled the border yet. In contrast, country like Brazil, who has 10 borders, they have settled their borders 40 years ago or 30 years ago. So territorial integrity is based on the idea of respecting your border and neighbor's border, so that the territorial issue would not start another conflict. The Minzoku Jiketsu, self-determination of people, this was the idea which triggered series of independent wars of Asia, Africa in the 1960s. Still is the contested concept in places like Tibet. Is this self-determination of people or not? All right, yes, Michael.
Question to Professor here. To legitimate the idea of bombing Syria because of the gas, maybe I'm not just knowledgeable in the subject, but I think we read in the news that the UN and the US presented evidence that the regime actually used chemical weapons against their own people. However, as far as I remember, these evidence were not presented publicly, but it just instead went to bombing directly without telling anyone anything, which causes a lot of confusion.
Yes, it is. It does. Syria is, I think you have to look at in a historical context. I was ambassador to the United Nations during the Obama period. And during the Obama administration, Syrian war already started, and the Assad regime used chemical weapons. President Obama said, if there is more chemical weapons used, this is for the United States red line. It breaks the red line. That means United States would intervene. In order to use the military force, he asked American Congress to give him authority. In the past, American presidents used force without asking authority. But he asked United States, the Senate, and they said, no, don't go. He dealt with the Russia after this statement, the red line, that Russia maneuvered or negotiated Syria to join the chemical weapon treaty and belong to the organization OPCW in Hague, the organization to control the chemical weapon. So Assad regime joined it. That means OPCW can go and check the evidence. Russia convinced Assad regime, if you don't do that, Americans come and bomb you. So this was Obama regime successfully convinced the Russians and Syria to use OPCW inspection, and this was used. Now, last year, president changed, and there was a bombing. There was once again use of chemical weapon. In between, there was a OPCW team went to Syria, and they came back with the evidence that Syrian government did actually use chemical weapons. So the Obama argument was right. This was actually used. And this joint inspection team was supposed to continue, but having given this evidence, Russia used the veto. So after during this the end of Obama regime, there was no longer inspection team authorized to go to Syria. Now, 2017 bombing happened, and there was no inspector going to Syria. So we don't know. But people mostly believe, American and British and other intelligence, that chemical weapon was used as circumstantial evidence of photos. And now second bombing was made. And looks like the OPCW will be going to Syria, but after everything has been cleaned. So that's, we don't no, and there is a plausible argument, but we haven't seen this evidence. Yes?
So my argument here is that I see no reason for a leader who is in a country of war to use a war crime and commit it not towards another people but his own people himself, but knowing that the world is watching and that there are international powers who can pressure him out of position or even execute him if so necessary. So his behavior of executing that kind of actions are just illogical to the greater scheme if he wants to stay in power. Why would he do something that could potentially take him down when he's struggling so much to stay there?
Syria is very advanced countries, intellectual people, and they know how to manage the situation. I think it's in order to change the Assad regime, you cannot change it simply by bombing from the air. You really have to reduce their military power, and I don't think anybody is ready to do that. Opposition, yes, exists, but they are scattered, they are not united, and Russians are helping the Assad government. Nobody is helping the anti-Assad government. They are advisors, but they don't want Frenchmen or British or American killed in Syria. So it's simple as that. I think he will remain in power. And losing Syria is a big loss for Russia. They want a port. They want a base. So they would keep helping Mr. Assad. And he is now stronger than before. So I don't know. It may be divided into Assad camp and anti-Assad, but reality is not as simple as that. So the question is that why President Assad has to use chemical weapon to win his war. He can win without using chemical weapon. So this is, I think this is the point that he has to think. And at least this international opinion, United Nations, would make a little bit of help. But we have to also understand why people are killed in the rebel-held areas, because they are not allowed to leave. Because if you leave, rebels, anti-government forces will kill you, because you need people to protect them. So you need young, you cannot say 100 soldiers died, nobody pity you, but there are 25 children died. So you need people. Yes, so the war has become very cruel in both sides in Syria. And so 5 million people went out of country, 5 million people left home to other part of Syria. We will speak about Syria later on the how to maintain this interest. I think it is the end of today's class. Okay, see you the day after tomorrow.